Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a deep dive into learner-centered teaching.
A topic I know you're really interested in.
Yeah, and to guide our exploration, we have Mary Ellen Weimer's book, Learner-Centered Teaching: 5 Key Changes to Practice.
It's a great book, really lays out,
A roadmap, almost.
yeah, a roadmap for understanding how teaching changes when we shift the focus,
To the learner.
right, to the learner, and what that means for, well, for everyone involved.
So let's jump right in. One of the first things that Weimer points out is this idea that higher education has, for so long, really focused on the teaching side of things.
Teaching skills.
Yeah, almost assuming that if you teach it, they will learn.
Right, like it's automatic.
Like osmosis or something. But I don't know about you,
Uh-huh.
but my experience hasn't always been like that. I've definitely sat through some, well-taught lectures
Yeah.
where I walked out and thought, did I actually learn anything?
I think we've all been there.
Yeah, and that's why this shift to learner-centered teaching is so important, because it really acknowledges that just because someone is standing at the front of the room,
Delivering information.
delivering information beautifully, it doesn't guarantee that learning is happening.
It really doesn't.
So how do we begin to make that shift? One of the concepts that Weimer introduces is this idea of the balance of power in the classroom.
Yeah, and it's a powerful concept.
So what does she mean by that?
Well, she's talking about where the control lies in a traditional classroom. Think about, say, a typical course syllabus,
Ah, yes, the syllabus.
often filled with rules, directives, no late submissions, mandatory attendance.
Yeah,
You'll
sure.
do this, you'll do that.
Exactly. Even the language itself can feel very authoritative.
I'm guilty of that, for sure.
Oh, I think we all are. But it all points to the instructor holding most of the power.
Right, and if we're talking about shifting to a learner-centered approach, how do we start to change that dynamic?
It's about recognizing that ultimately the decision to learn rests with the student. With the student.
Yeah. You can have the most brilliant lesson plan, the most engaging activities, but if the student isn't motivated to learn.
It's all for naught.
Exactly.
So then, what happens to the role of content?
It's not about throwing content at students.
Right.
It's about using it as a tool to help them build those essential learning muscles.
Which brings us to another key point from Weimer. She says content in learner-centered teaching actually serves a dual purpose.
It still builds knowledge, of course,
Yeah.
but it's also about developing learning skills through engaging with that content.
So it's not just what you know, but how you learn.
Exactly. It's about those critical thinking skills,
Hmm.
problem solving, analytical skills,
Yeah.
all the things that will allow students to be lifelong learners long after they've left our classrooms.
And she uses a really interesting study about engineering students to make this point.
Oh, right. The one where
These students, they solved thousands of problems.
tons of content.
You'd think they'd be experts by then.
Right, but their problem-solving skills, they showed little improvement.
So just going through the motions, even with really challenging material.
Doesn't automatically mean they're developing those deeper learning skills.
Right. So how do we shift from just doing the work to actually learning how to learn?
Weimer says we have to be very intentional about teaching learning skills.
Okay, so like what kinds of things are we talking about?
Things like reading critically, thinking analytically, approaching problems strategically.
And all of this, using the content as a means to an end.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. But do you have any specific examples of how to do that? How do we actually use content to teach these learning skills?
Well, she talks about using supplementary materials that go beyond just telling students what to do. Instead of saying, take notes, give them a handout that analyzes research on, like, effective note-taking techniques.
Oh, I like that.
So they're not just taking notes, they're understanding the why and the how.
Right, it's meta. It's like note-taking about note-taking.
Exactly. Another example is her last 5-minute strategy.
Okay, tell me more about that one.
So instead of letting class just kind of fizzle out at the end,
Which happens a lot, let's be honest.
it does, yeah. Use those last 5 minutes for a summarizing activity. Have students pair up, discuss key takeaways, or connect what they learned to their own lives.
That's a great idea. Turning those often wasted minutes into valuable learning opportunities.
Exactly.
And I remember she also talked about using exams as a way to teach learning skills.
Oh, yeah. One of her suggestions was to have students go back and look at their
I
exam.
mean, not just to see their grade.
Right, but to analyze where they changed their answers and whether those changes actually helped or hurt their score.
So it's about helping them understand their own test-taking strategies.
And become more aware of their thinking processes It turns the exam itself into a learning experience.
I love that. It's like we're constantly looking for ways to embed learning into everything we do.
Exactly. Building those metacognitive skills.
Metacognitive, thinking about thinking.
Right. And that's essential for becoming a more effective learner.
Okay, this is all making so much sense. But I have to admit, I'm starting to feel a little, I don't know, maybe a little insecure about my own role.
Insecure.
Yeah, like if I'm not the sage on the stage, the one with all the answers,
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
then what am I? What does the instructor become in a learner-centered classroom?
That's a common fear.
Yeah.
And Weimer addresses it directly. She says this isn't about diminishing the role of the instructor at all.
Okay, good.
It's about shifting the focus from content expert to facilitator, guide, and designer of learning experiences.
So instead of being in the spotlight, we're more like,
The director behind the scenes.
okay, yeah, I like that analogy.
Setting the stage, providing guidance, creating opportunities for students to take ownership.
But I have to be honest, letting go of that control,
It can be scary.
it can be, for me at least. I like being the one with the answers.
I think that's natural.
And she even shares a story, right, about a time when she tried a really open-ended assignment.
Oh, yeah. And
It
it
totally bombed.
completely backfired. The students felt overwhelmed by the freedom.
So it's not just about throwing responsibility at them and saying, okay, you're in charge now.
Definitely not. It's about scaffolding responsibility.
Scaffolding, like building a support structure.
Exactly. Starting small, providing clear expectations, and gradually increasing their autonomy as they develop their learning skills.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're not just setting them free, we're building them up to be able to handle that freedom.
Exactly. It's about meeting students where they are developmentally.
And speaking of developmental stages, Weimer mentions a model by Grow.
Yes, with 4 stages.
Dependence, interested, involved, and self-directed.
It's a helpful framework for understanding how learners progress towards greater autonomy and self-direction.
So let's break those down. In that first stage, dependence.
Students rely heavily on the instructor for guidance, directions, structure. They need clear instructions, frequent feedback, a lot of reassurance,
So it's like, tell me what to do and tell me I'm doing it right.
basically. But as they move towards being interested, involved, and eventually self-directed, the instructor's role changes too.
How so?
They become more capable of taking initiative, making choices, setting their own learning goals,
Okay, so the instructor starts to step back.
and becomes more of a facilitator, mentor, guide.
It's a dance, really.
It is.
Yeah.
But how do we know when students are ready for that next step?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we support them as they move through those stages?
It's about observation and assessment. We need to be attuned to the cues they're giving us, both through their behavior in class and through their work.
So are they asking thoughtful questions, taking initiative, seeking out feedback, and using it to improve?
Exactly. Those are all great indicators. And as we observe those signs of growth,
We adjust our teaching accordingly, offering more choices, more open-ended tasks.
there are more opportunities for them to take ownership.
Like we're constantly calibrating the level of support we provide to match their needs. But even with all this scaffolding and support, there's still that big question of evaluation.
Right. Assessment.
Yeah.
How do we measure learning in a way that aligns with this learner-centered approach?
Because traditional grading systems, they often focus so much on points and percentages.
It creates a very transactional view of learning,
Students start focusing on the grade, not the learning.
and that can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. Cheating, grade grubbing,
It becomes a game.
and not a very fun one.
So how do we shift the focus back to learning? How do we use assessment to support and enhance the process, not just measure it?
Weimer has some great ideas here. One of the most important is involving students in the evaluation process itself.
Wait, you mean actually letting students have a say in how they're assessed?
Exactly. Maybe having them help create the grading criteria for assignments or giving them opportunities for self-assessment and peer feedback.
Oh, I like that. It gives them ownership and it helps them develop those critical thinking skills by having to articulate what quality work looks like. What are some other ways we can make evaluation more meaningful and learning focused?
Weimer suggests using a wider variety of assessment methods, beyond just traditional tests and papers.
Like what?
Think portfolios, presentations, projects. Even having students create their own test questions.
Oh, that's a good one. Having to create test questions forces them to really grapple with the material.
And think about it from a different perspective. By using these more authentic and varied forms of assessment, we can get a much richer picture of what students are actually learning.
It's about making evaluation a tool for learning, not just a way to measure performance.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all really resonating with me, but I can't help but think about the
The
logistics.
practical side of things.
Yeah. Learner-centered teaching sounds amazing in theory, but how do we actually make it work in our real-world classrooms? We've got packed lecture halls, limited resources.
Maybe even pushback from colleagues who are used to doing things a certain way.
How do we address those practical challenges?
Those are all valid concerns, and Weimer doesn't shy away from them. Okay, good.
So let's dive into those practical considerations next.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us are sitting here thinking, okay, this sounds great, but how do I actually do this?
She offers a lot of concrete advice and strategies, but first, it's important to remember that this is a journey, not a destination.
Okay, so we don't have to transform everything overnight.
Exactly. It's about taking small steps, experimenting, figuring out what works best for you and your students.
And she has some great tips for getting started.
She does.
Lay them on me.
Ah,
What are some practical steps we can take to start moving towards a more learner-centered approach?
one of her most important suggestions is to thoroughly study the new approach you want to try.
Okay, so do your homework.
Right. Understand the research, the best practices, the why behind the changes you want to make.
So take a learner-centered approach to becoming a learner-centered teacher. I like that.
Haha, exactly. But reading and researching is one thing.
Right, putting it into practice is another. So then once you've done your homework, she suggests that you thoroughly assess your current teaching practices.
So before we even start thinking about specific learner-centered techniques.
We need to know our starting point.
Okay, I could see that. And then?
She encourages instructors to embrace the idea of tinkering with their teaching.
Tinkering, like playing around with different approaches.
Exactly. Viewing teaching as an ongoing process of exploration.
I love that. It takes the pressure off of having to get everything perfect right away.
And it makes teaching more engaging and fun, both for you and your students.
But how do we tinker productively?
She suggests a few key principles to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm ready to hear them. What are some of the guiding principles for tinkering with our teaching in a way that moves us towards a more learner-centered approach?
One of the most important is to be systematic. Don't just randomly try new things.
Right, right.
Have a plan, set clear goals, track your progress.
So it's like setting up a little experiment.
Exactly. We have a hypothesis, we test it out, and then we collect data to see what happened.
Love it. What else?
Another key principle is to involve students in the change process.
Ah, yes, because it's about empowering them.
Right. So why not involve them in shaping the learning environment?
That's a great idea. Even something as simple as asking for their feedback on a new activity or giving them choices about how they want to demonstrate their learning.
Exactly. And speaking of feedback,
Oh, yes, feedback.
Weimer emphasizes that getting feedback, both from students and from peers, is crucial for growth and improvement.
But I know a lot of faculty can be resistant to peer observation. It can feel very intrusive and evaluative.
Again,
How do we make that process more constructive and supportive?
it's about shifting the focus from judgment to learning. Instead of asking a colleague to come in and evaluate your teaching,
Right.
invite them in to observe a specific aspect of your class and provide descriptive feedback.
Ooh, I like that.
So you might say, for example, hey, I'm trying to incorporate more active learning strategies into my lectures. Would you be willing to come observe a class and give me feedback on how engaged the students seem to be?
I like that. It's much less threatening, more focused on growth and improvement.
And it can be a great way to get fresh perspectives and ideas.
This is all so helpful. I feel like I'm getting a much clearer picture of what it takes to actually put learner-centered teaching into practice. But what about when things don't go as planned?
Oh, that happened.
Because we've all had those moments where we try something new in the classroom and it just totally bombs.
Absolutely. Weimer acknowledges that setbacks are inevitable.
But we shouldn't let those failures discourage us.
Right. It's about learning from those experiences, adjusting our approach, and continuing to tinker until we find what works.
And one of the best ways to learn from those experiences.
Is to get feedback, both from students and from peers.
Feedback can be tough to hear, though, especially for teachers who are used to being the experts in the room. How do we make ourselves more receptive to feedback, even when it's critical?
Weimer offers some great advice on that.
Okay.
She encourages instructors to start by recognizing that we're all emotionally invested in our teaching,
Oh, absolutely.
and that can make it hard to be objective.
Totally.
So she suggests that we work on cultivating more objectivity, trying to think and speak about our teaching in descriptive rather than evaluative terms.
So instead of saying, I'm a terrible lecturer, you might say, I noticed that students seem less engaged during my lectures.
Exactly. It's about focusing on observable behaviors and patterns rather than making sweeping judgments.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that kind of descriptive language makes it easier to identify specific areas for improvement.
Right. But where do we get that descriptive feedback? Student evaluations can be helpful,
They can be.
but they're often very general.
Right.
So what does she suggest?
Go beyond those end-of-semester evaluations and seek out more specific formative feedback throughout the course.
So check in with students regularly to see how they're experiencing the class.
Exactly. Through quick surveys, minute papers, even just informal conversations.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Scaffolding responsibility, using a variety of assessment methods, embracing a mindset of tinkering with our teaching.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but there's still one big elephant in the room that we haven't addressed yet.
And that is,
Resistance.
ah, yes.
Resistance.
What about those students or even colleagues who might be resistant to this whole idea of learner-centered teaching? How do we deal with that?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll definitely dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
Because let's face it, change can be challenging.
It can.
And not everyone is going to embrace a new approach with open arms.
Especially one as fundamental as this. But Weimer offers some helpful strategies for dealing with resistance, for navigating those tricky conversations. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to unpacking that in the next part.
Me too.
Because I think a lot of us are probably anticipating some pushback, both from students who are used to a more traditional approach and from colleagues who might be skeptical.
It's understandable.
But we'll be armed with Weimer's wisdom. So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into learner-centered teaching.
We'll see you then.
Okay, so we're back and ready to dig even deeper into this idea of learner-centered teaching.
And as promised, we're tackling the big question of resistance.
Because, let's be honest, not everyone is going to jump for joy when we start changing things up in the classroom.
Especially when we're talking about a shift as big as this one, right? Moving from a teacher-centered to a learner-centered approach.
So let's break it down, starting with students.
Yeah, students, what are some of the reasons they might resist?
I can imagine some students feeling a little lost, maybe even a little scared.
Exactly. That fear often comes from a feeling of losing control.
Like, wait, you're not going to just tell me what to do.
Exactly. They're used to that traditional model, the sit-and-get approach.
Just give me the information, I'll memorize it, and I'll be good to go.
Right. And now we're asking them to take more responsibility for their own learning,
Which can be intimidating.
especially for students who are used to being told exactly what to do.
So how do we help them overcome those fears and anxieties? How do we get them on board with this new way of learning?
Well, first and foremost, we need to communicate clearly.
Communicate.
Yeah, explain the why behind the changes we're making.
Don't just say we're doing things differently this semester. Tell them why we're doing things differently.
Exactly. And highlight the benefits of a learner-centered approach.
So we might say something like, this class is designed to help you develop lifelong learning skills. Skills that will be valuable to you long after you graduate.
Exactly. Frame the changes in a positive, empowering way.
And I imagine a healthy dose of encouragement goes a long way, too.
It really does. Students need to know that we believe in them, especially when they're feeling unsure or resistant.
So offering specific praise, acknowledging their effort, celebrating their successes,
All those little things add up.
they create that supportive environment where students feel safe to take risks and try new things.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about student resistance, but what about our colleagues? What about those faculty members who might be skeptical of learner-centered teaching?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that faculty resistance often comes from a different place than student resistance.
How so?
Well, some faculty members might feel threatened by this idea of giving up control, changing their traditional role in the classroom.
Yeah, I can see that. Some professors might feel like their expertise is being questioned.
Right, like if students are taking more ownership of their learning, then what's the role of the expert?
Exactly. So how do we approach those conversations with our colleagues in a way that's respectful and productive?
Well, I think it starts with empathy.
Empathy.
Yeah, recognizing that change can be hard and that letting go of familiar ways of doing things can be uncomfortable.
So how do we get them on board?
It's not about trying to convince them they're wrong. or that our way is better.
Right, right.
It's about sharing our own experiences, the successes we've seen with learner-centered teaching, and inviting them to join us in a spirit of collaboration.
So maybe invite them to observe our classes, share articles and resources, have open and honest conversations about our teaching practices.
Exactly. Create that space for dialogue and shared learning.
That sounds ideal, but let's be realistic. Even with the best intentions, there are going to be challenges.
Oh, for sure. We're talking about a fundamental shift in the way we think about education. So bumps in the road are inevitable.
And that can be discouraging.
It can be. But Weimer reminds us to be patient. Patient with ourselves and with our students.
This isn't about reaching some perfect endpoint.
It's about the journey.
The journey of continuously learning and growing, both as teachers and as learners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she has a whole chapter on practical considerations, right, to help us navigate that journey.
She does. What are some of the key takeaways from that chapter?
Well, one of the most important is to be realistic about our goals and expectations.
So don't try to change everything overnight.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Start small, focus on 1 or 2 changes at a time, celebrate those small victories.
And be flexible.
Oh, yes. Flexibility is key. Because learner-centered teaching isn't a one-size-fits-all approach.
So it's not about rigidly following a formula.
It's about being responsive and creative in how we apply these principles.
Okay, I'm liking this. It feels less daunting now.
Good. And finally, she reminds us that this is an ongoing process of learning and growth, both for us and for our students.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? That we never stop learning and growing no matter what our role is in the classroom.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the what and the why of learner-centered teaching, and we've explored some of the how.
The practical strategies, the ways to deal with resistance, the importance of being realistic and flexible.
It's a lot to process, but I'm feeling energized. I don't know about you.
I am too. It's exciting to think about all the possibilities.
And if you're feeling inspired, I highly recommend checking out Weimer's book, Learner-Centered Teaching.
She goes into much more depth, provides lots of examples and resources.
It's a great companion to our deep dive.
Yes.
But before we wrap up, there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
Which is?
Evaluation. How do we assess student learning in a way that aligns with this learner-centered approach? We touched on this a bit earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive.
I agree. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Because if we're asking students to take more ownership of their learning, we need to make sure our evaluation methods reflect that shift.
Right. Traditional grading systems, with their emphasis on points and percentages, can sometimes undermine the very goals we're trying to achieve with learner-centered teaching.
It's like we're sending mixed messages. We're saying, be creative, be curious, take risks, but then we're evaluating them based on how well they memorize facts and follow instructions.
Exactly. And that can create a lot of anxiety and frustration for students.
So how do we break free from that traditional model? How do we create evaluation systems that truly support and enhance student learning?
That's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So stay tuned for more insights from Mary Ellen Weimer and our own reflections on this important topic.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into learner-centered teaching.
And we're ready to tackle that big question we left you with.
Resistant.
Yeah, how do we deal with those folks who might not be so thrilled about this whole learner-centered thing?
Because let's be real, change can be a little scary sometimes.
Especially when it's a change as big as this one.
So let's start with the students. What are some of the reasons they might push back?
Well, Weimer points out that a lot of their resistance stems from fear.
Fear.
Yeah, fear of the unknown, fear of failing, fear of not being good enough.
It makes sense, right? They're used to a certain way of doing things.
And this learner-centered approach asks them to step outside their comfort zone.
Take more responsibility.
Make more decisions.
And that can be a little daunting, especially for students who are used to just being told what to do.
It's like, wait, you're not going to give me all the answers?
Do you want me to figure it out on my own?
Exactly. And for some students, that can feel overwhelming.
So how do we help them through that? How do we get them to buy into this new way of learning?
Communication is key.
Communication.
Yeah. We need to be super clear about why we're making these changes.
And why they should be excited about them.
Exactly. Highlight the benefits.
Like what?
Well, instead of just saying, we're doing things differently this semester, we can say something like, this class is designed to help you develop the skills you need to be successful in any field, not just this specific subject.
So it's not just about memorizing facts for a test.
It's about learning how to think critically,
Yeah.
solve problems creatively, communicate effectively.
Those are skills that will serve them well no matter what they do in life.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got to sell it to them.
We do. And a little encouragement goes a long way too.
Encourage.
Yeah. Students need to know that we believe in them, even when they're doubting themselves.
So praise their efforts, celebrate their successes, no matter how small.
It all contributes to creating that safe and supportive environment where they feel comfortable taking risks.
Okay, that makes sense for students. But what about our colleagues? How do we deal with resistance from other faculty members?
That's a good question, and it's important to remember that their resistance might come from a different place than student resistance.
How so?
Well, for some faculty, this whole learner-centered thing might feel like a threat.
A threat.
Yeah, like it's undermining their authority, their expertise.
I can see that. It challenges the traditional power dynamic in the classroom.
Exactly. And it can be hard for some professors to let go of that control.
So how do we approach those conversations? How do we talk to our colleagues about learner-centered teaching without making them defensive?
It's tricky, for sure,
It is.
but I think it starts with respect. Yeah, recognizing that they have their own experiences, their own beliefs about teaching and learning.
And that those beliefs are valid.
Absolutely. We don't have to agree with them,
Right.
but we do need to respect them.
So maybe instead of trying to convince them that they're wrong, we could focus on sharing our own experiences.
The successes we've seen with learner-centered teaching,
The challenges we've faced too.
right, and invite them to learn alongside us.
So invite them to observe our classes, share articles and resources, maybe even co-plan a lesson or two.
Exactly. It's about creating a dialogue, a community of practice where we can all learn from each other.
I like that. But even with the best intentions, there are going to be bumps along the way.
Oh, for sure. Change is never easy. We're talking about changing a system that's been in place for centuries.
So how do we stay the course? How do we avoid getting discouraged when things get tough?
Weimar reminds us to be patient with ourselves, with our students, with our colleagues.
It's not about reaching some perfect endpoint.
It's about the journey.
The journey of continuous improvement.
And she offers some great advice for navigating that journey too.
Okay, give me the highlights. What are some of the key things to keep in mind as we embark on this learner-centered adventure?
Well, first and foremost, be realistic.
Realistic.
Yeah, don't try to do everything at once.
Start small
Exactly. Pick one or two changes you want to make and focus on those.
and celebrate those small wins along the way.
Absolutely. And be flexible.
Flexible.
Yeah, because what works for one student or one class might not work for another.
So we have to be willing to adapt, to experiment, to find what works best in each unique situation.
Exactly. And finally, remember that this is a journey, not a destination.
We're all learning and growing along the way.
Teachers and students alike.
I love that. It's a reminder that we're all in this together.
We are. And that's the beauty of learner-centered teaching. It's not about the teacher having all the answers.
It's about creating a space where everyone can learn and grow.
Exactly. And that's a powerful thing.
It is. And I think it's a fitting place to wrap up our deep dive into learner-centered teaching.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. We talked about the 5 key changes Weimar outlines, the practical strategies for implementing them, the challenges we might face along the way.
And hopefully we've inspired you to take that first step to start exploring the possibilities of learner-centered teaching in your own classroom.
Because as Weimar reminds us, it's not about being perfect.
It's about being present.
Present for our students, present for ourselves, and present for the amazing journey of teaching and learning.
So keep learning, keep growing, and keep sharing your passion for teaching with the world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.